But as we wait for Premier Ford to emerge from that meeting, we want to talk about what is taking place here. And to help us do that, we're now joined by Robert Benzie, Queen's Park Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star, and Sabrina Nanji, the author of the Queen's Park Observer newsletter. They're both in Toronto. Hello to both of you.
Hey, Michael.
Hey, Michael. Hey, Sabrina.
So here we have the great drama of Canadian politics. We see the Ontario Premier walking down the hallway to meet with the Lieutenant Governor. But, as I said here, Rob, this is going to lead to an early election call. And by that, we mean a year and a half early for the Ontario Premier. For people outside the province, why is this happening right now?
Well, it's happening for a lot of reasons, Michael. Number one is Doug Ford's polling is really good, so he can win the election. They want to get out in front of the RCMP investigation into the Greenbelt land swap scandal. They'd like to get out in front of a federal election that Pierre Poilievre's Conservatives are expected to win, and they know that there's a tradition in Ontario that when people elect the Conservatives federally, they tend not to elect them provincially. They tend to go with the Liberals, and in one instance, the New Democrats. So there's those reasons, but then there's the reason that Mr. Ford is giving for having this election, and that's Donald Trump's 25% tariffs that take effect potentially this Saturday. Mr. Ford is very worried about what that'll do to the province's economy. He's talked about 500,000 jobs being lost. So he wants a fresh mandate, he says, so that he can, if he has to spend tens of billions of dollars on a stimulus package, he will be therefore justified. He said he'll have the permission of the people, even though he already has a majority government, and he had one at least until an hour, about 15 minutes from now. He had one until June 2026. So.
Yeah, June 2026. That's when he had until to call another election. But, Sabrina, let's pick up on some of the points that Rob was making there, beginning with the argument that we are hearing from the Ontario Premier, because to hear it from Doug Ford, and he was signaling this even before today, as there's been wide speculation for months now that he would be triggering an early election. But that took a turn in the new year with the tariffs. Doug Ford kind of putting himself out there as a Captain Canada, saying that he needs a fresh mandate, a large mandate, in order to take on Donald Trump and the tariff threats. What is being said about that reasoning, Sabrina?
Yeah, I mean, as Benzie pointed out, this is the rationale that Ford is giving the public, but this is something that, he has refused to rule out since last May, obviously long before Trump came to power and was threatening tariffs. If you ask the opposition parties, they're saying that this is just a complete self-serving move by the Premier to, not only shore up his job, but also to outrun, whatever the RCMP Greenbelt investigation is going to say. I do think that, there are some vulnerabilities for the Premier here. He is riding high in the polls. The NDP and the Liberals aren't even coming close to him right now, as Rob pointed out. But at the same time, it's only going to be a matter of time. Once we start to see these tariffs come down, whatever that happens to look like, I think the public will be looking for someone to blame. And, if Ford is sort of putting himself in that role as the steady hand, he could get some backlash for this. At the same time, I think it will also be difficult for the opposition critics to really run against him when he's, making trips to Washington during this campaign and really, going to bat for Ontario and Canada. That also makes it a little difficult for Marit Stiles and Bonnie Crombie to really criticize the Premier when he's out there with that Captain Canada cape. So there's a lot of themes that are emerging in this election, but, pollsters are saying to us that the Trump tariffs aren't, that high on people's radar. They're more concerned with cost of living and housing. And I think for the opposition, it's going to be crucial for them to keep reminding people of, Ford's record on that and really, I guess, take him to task and try to pull down some of those high polling numbers that we're seeing.
Yeah, well, although, the high polling numbers right now, and you've now both mentioned the RCMP investigation to the Greenbelt, and, had an election taken place around the height of that controversy, chances are Doug Ford would be facing a much tougher fight in this provincial campaign. But, for people who are not in Ontario, again, we're dealing with a national audience here, Rob. I'm going to ask you to rewind a bit. Walk us through that controversy, because ultimately this was about building on protected land.
Yeah, I mean, the Greenbelt is this 2 million acre swath of protected land around the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, and it was It's been around for about 20 something years now that Premier Dalton McGuinty created it. And when they did create it, there were always, it's not the Amazon rainforest, Michael. There are parts that you kind of look at and think, why is that protected land? It's right beside a highway, and there's a subdivision right across the street. So it's always been contentious to some of the landowners. And in November 2022, even though Premier Ford had assured voters that he wouldn't open up the Greenbelt, he felt that he needed to do that. And he opened up 7,400 acres of land that they claimed was ready to build on right away. Now, the problem is that the Auditor General and the Integrity Commissioner both found that those parcels of land were connected to quote unquote certain favored developers with connections to the Progressive Conservative Party. And so the optics were not great for the government, but he stuck to it. And it was only when his poll numbers, as you mentioned, Michael, they started to drop in August 2023 and September 2023. They dropped so far that the premier backed off of it and canceled it in September 2023. But the Mounties still swept in the following month, and their investigation is ongoing to this day. They've interviewed more than a dozen people around Mr. Ford. They haven't interviewed the premier yet, but he has insisted he has done nothing wrong, and he has told his aides, that current and former, that they must cooperate with the investigation, and they have been.
Yeah, absolutely, and without a doubt, the whole controversy around the Greenbelt in the second term of the Ford government has arguably been the low point for them when it comes to polling numbers. Yeah. But Sabrina, Rob mentions the RCMP investigation that is underway, and I guess the difficulty here is for both opposition and the governing party is that they don't really know when that investigation wraps up, when a report wraps up, and in a lot of ways, this is a control measure for the PC government of Ontario to try to get ahead of the issue, again, not knowing when the final report will drop. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, they're no longer controlling the narrative on this. And, whatever the RCMP investigation, whatever comes out of that, obviously they don't know. And it's a wild card for them. I think definitely, even though the premier has backed off of that now and has done this damage control, I think that it just sort of plays in, at least for the opposition critics, it's just more fodder for them. We keep hearing the same rhetoric from them, that Doug Ford is only in it for his buddies and his insiders, his pals. He's not really in it for the people, and so that, I think that's the theme we're going to be hearing from the opposition critics. That ties into the call for this election. Don't forget, in 1990, then Liberal Premier David Peterson pulled the trigger on a snap vote. It was a risk, and that ended up backfiring. We got our first and only NDP government with Bob Rae after that, and that's also not lost on the premier. So I think really it's going to come down to the justification for why we're going to the polls early when he's already got this whopping majority, and opposition critics have said that they're willing to support a stimulus package that to fight these tariffs.
And again, the Trump tariffs being his raison d'etre for triggering this early election. But Rob, I'm wondering what you've heard then from conservative strategists, because from what I'm hearing, my vantage point here in Ottawa is that they were pretty enthusiastic about calling the vote early. Have you heard anything contrary to that within the PC party?
No, most of the people around the premier are enthusiastic about going now, because they know the getting may not be this good again, Michael. Here's one thing that they worry about. Premier Ford has talked about the fear of these Trump tariffs, and it could cost 500,000 jobs in Ontario. Ontario's economy is very dependent upon trade. So let's say that the worst thing happens and we're in a trade war for a year with the United States, and factories in Windsor and in Oakville and in Alliston and in Oshawa are shuttered because they can't get the parts that they need from auto factories. The industry is so integrated between Mexico, the United States, and Canada, specifically Ontario and Michigan and Mexico, that you could have tens of thousands of workers with nothing to do, and that's a recipe for disaster for any incumbent government. So, do you want to be facing voters in June 2026 when there are a lot of unemployed people in Ontario? So if you're Mr. Ford, certainly not. He's he's very much more effective, I think, in good times. Although you could argue that during the pandemic he had to adjust, and I think that's when the guardrails of government kind of foisted themselves on Mr. Ford, and I think that's why he was rewarded with re-election in 2022, is because Ontario's performance during the COVID-19 pandemic was better than Quebec, better than Manitoba, better than New York, better than Michigan. But the idea that the prospect of all these unemployed people in Ontario because of these Trump tariffs, that scares the hell out of Mr. Ford.
Yeah, it scares him, as you say, creates his own death threat. But where does that leave the opposition, though? Because here we have Doug Ford doing well in the polls, his party doing well in the polls right now, and with both Marit Stiles of the NDP, the leader of the official opposition, and with Bonnie Crombie of the Liberals, both of them are relatively new leaders that arguably Ontarians don't know very well, Sabrina. So what type of challenge does that set up for each of them?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, Doug Ford is doing so well in the polls, and I think that part of that is not only because people are very happy with him. His approval rating is actually not doing so hot right now, but it also has to do with the fact that our opposition is relatively weak. They've had a hard time getting their message out there, getting it to stick. You mentioned their relatively new leaders, Marit Stiles and Bonnie Crombie. The polls suggest that people don't really know Marit Stiles, though those people that do know her tend to like her. It's just, not enough of them know about her. And Bonnie Crombie is having to do damage control because she's been fighting, a multi-million-dollar attack ad buy from the Conservatives that they've been rolling out for months. And so I think that that's also been hard for the opposition critics to contend with, and it's going to make it difficult during the campaign. I think people might be paying more attention now that we're in the thick of it. But I think it will be a struggle for them because they aren't anywhere close to raising the same amount of cash or being able to do the same kind of advertising that the Conservatives have really been doing. I also think that with the premier and looking back at 1990 with David Peterson, if you sort of take that example when he called the snap vote, the Conservatives at the time were just landing blow after blow with Peterson, and that sort of helped the NDP and Bob Rae, capture some of those alternative votes. And so I do think that, it's going to be a struggle for the opposition. This snap vote is something we've been talking about for months, but all parties are scrambling to really get their ducks in a row. They don't even have no party has a full slate of candidates nominated quite yet. That could happen any day now, but it has been a bit of a scramble for them to really get themselves together before, the big day.
Yeah, the big day. And I think, Rob, that's important to point out, because while the premier is right now meeting with the lieutenant governor, the writs actually will not be dropped until tomorrow, which means to say that really until tomorrow, when that happens, that's when the election truly begins, come Wednesday, not today on Tuesday.
Yeah, and that's why the premier is headed to Windsor, Ontario, tonight for an event to formally launch his campaign tomorrow against the backdrop of the Ambassador Bridge and the Detroit skyline, to sort of underscore to Ontarians that the frame of this election, in his view, is the Trump tariffs and the need to keep that border open and trade flowing. The opposition leaders, to what Sabrina was just saying, their challenge is to get people talking about other things, namely 2.5 million Ontarians don't have a family doctor. That is a huge potential political problem for Mr. Ford's government. We know from the polling that Abacus Data did for the Star that healthcare is the second or third top issue for most voters. Affordability is number one. Trump tariffs are actually quite low, relatively speaking, but that could be tied to jobs in the economy and affordability too. If we're in a trade war and American goods suddenly cost 25% more, I think everyone's going to be feeling the pinch.
Yeah, and I think, Sabrina, that raises for me an interesting question, because when it comes to campaigns, oftentimes you begin with a set of expectations of what a campaign is going to be about, but you can never tell where it takes a turn. And as Rob says, you have over 2 million Ontarians right now without access to primary care. And Doug Ford has appointed Jane Philpott, Dr. Jane Philpott, former Liberal federal health minister, to bring about some type of solution. But that said, it could ultimately be a sleeper issue for this campaign, because people do struggle to get health care in Ontario.
Yep.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, that's something that Doug Ford, is going to have some explaining to do. He's been in power for 6 years. He's had this majority mandate, and meanwhile, we're hearing stories about over in Walkerton, people lining up in the cold, in the snow for hours just to have access to a family doctor. So I think, really, we're going to be hearing a lot of that from the opposition parties, and also housing too. I think is a major issue. Cost of living, healthcare, and housing is something we keep hearing about. And obviously, it's going to be up to the opposition critics to, remind people of Ford's record on that. They have, housing starts have really tanked. They're nowhere near where they need to be for the Ford government to fulfill its ambitious goal to build housing. And if, Mart Stiles or Bonnie Crombie are standing in an empty lot during this campaign and say, Doug Ford promised there would be housing here, there's no housing here, I think that, that's a really big vulnerability for the premier.
Mm-hmm. And up against those concerns, housing, healthcare, there's also the fact that this government is issuing a $200 check to every Ontarian who filed taxes in, I think 2023, Rob? I think that's the rationale behind that.
And their children who didn't file taxes, Michael.
Okay.
15 million people. It's a $3 billion giveaway, and coincidentally, those checks are arriving in mailboxes right now.
So does that become a plus or a negative for this government? Because on the one hand, you are issuing these checks as the government of Ontario, but on the other hand, are some real public needs, healthcare, housing amongst them?
Well, certainly. I mean, the government announced on Monday, I guess it was, $1.8 billion toward primary care reform to try to expedite the facilitating of doctors for all those 2.5 million families or people that don't have one. But then, they're giving away, a $1.2 billion more than that in one-time relief. $200 is a lot of people will be happy to get that in the mail, but are they going to see it as a pre-election bribe? Sometimes these things can come back to bite you, Michael. It looks so nakedly obvious. Yeah.
Well, listen, and I appreciate the fact that two of you have been here helping us walk through as we were waiting for this meeting to wrap. I know, Rob, you have this other job that you have a deadline with. So before I say goodbye to both of you and we kind of move on here, I want to get some thoughts as to what you're going to be watching out for, because unlike many other jurisdictions in this country, Ontario has a clearly defined election period. Once the writs are dropped, we're talking about a 28-day election period, not too short, not too long. So what are you watching out for? Rob, I'll get you to start us off.
Well, between now and February 27th, what I'm going to be looking for, Michael, is Mr. Ford going to be cruising like he's a front runner and not taking any chances? What happens, for example, if Mr. Trump's tariffs don't come in on Saturday, as we all think they might? If that happens, then the whole rationale for the election is kind of is set aside. What if Trump says, "Yeah, I've reached a deal with Canada, there's no need for tariffs"? Well, then there was no need for an election. So at least if that's the rationale that Mr. Ford has chosen. So I'm going to be watching for that. And we're also going to be watching to see if Mr. Ford is the candidate that he was in 2022 when he pretty much won every single day, or is he going to be the candidate in 2018 when he had some rocky times on the campaign trail? He had some setbacks, and he was fortunate that his party won, but there were days that it looked like the NDP might actually win.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Sabrina, what are you watching out for?
Yeah, I think like Rob, I'm also going to be, paying close attention to this wild card with the situation in Washington and, how Doug Ford is going to roll with those punches and how the people are going to react to it. But, beyond that, I think I'm also going to be looking at the race for second place, at least for now, according to the polls between the Liberals and the NDP. There's a lot of battleground ridings between those two, and even the Conservatives and the NDP in a lot of areas, like in the 905 in the north and the Windsor area. And so I'm sort of looking in those regional battles. Will Bonnie Crombie and Mart Stiles be able to hang on to those seats, or even be competitive compared to what the Conservatives are doing?
As I say, 28-day campaign. Robert Benzie, Toronto Star, thank you to you, Sabrina Nanji. I'm